Shinzo Abe, former prime minister and Japan's longest serving. In the midst of a speech, he was shot twice with a homemade shotgun by Tetsuya Yamagami. Despite Abe's towering status in Japanese politics, Yamagami declared his action not political. Instead, his motive was a personal grudge against the Unification Church, though Abe himself wasn't even a member. The assassination was met with outrage, as citizens across Japan mourned Abe as a martyr and offered support for the maligned Unification Church. Or, that's what you'd expect. But in reality, public reverence for Abe quickly collapsed. By the end of the month, a majority of Japanese opposed his state funeral. What's more, anti-Unification Church sentiment has burst into the spotlight, driving Abe's own party to cut all ties, accepting the assassin's premise. But that is just the beginning of this expectation-defying story, featuring mass weddings, Richard Nixon, the Second Coming of Christ, an NC-17 retelling of the Garden of Eden, and so much more. This is the story of the Unification Church, and what it has to do with Shinzo Abe. And it's a story that has a lot to teach us about the tricky balancing act of separating church and state.
Oh, you just got a call from Jason? What'd he say?
To start this crazy story, we have to travel back to the 1930s to Japanese-occupied Korea. Towards the end of the decade, a Korean teenager had a vision. While praying one day, Jesus appeared before him and declared it would be up to him to complete God's work on earth, to bring about a world of peace and love. So begins the story of Sun Myung Moon. At least that is, according to Sun Myung Moon.
Like that's ever gonna happen.
Soon, his vision had a scripture, the divine principle, a radical revision of Christian teaching. Before long, the communist authorities of North Korea caught wind of his preaching and threw Moon.
Does this have to do with the people who believe that Jesus or his brother escaped to Japan and lived out the rest of his days in northern Japan?
Jail. Though he escaped, this time in captivity made his crusade all the more urgent. But what did Moon preach that was so radical? Well, for starters, he rewrote the story of the Garden of Eden, asserting that Eve, rather than eating the apple, committed adultery with Satan, a completely new account of original sin. Later, God put Jesus on earth to save mankind, yes, but he'd actually meant for Jesus to get married. Rather than his triumph, the lonely crucifixion.
I mean, arguably, there is evidence to believe that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. That's neither here nor there.
Fiction was Jesus's failure. But fear not, for the time had finally come for a new Christ. And, as luck would have it, Moon was just the man for the job. But Moon's theology was more than a rewrite of scripture and a declaration of his own divinity. Lurking just beneath the surface was a peculiar political perspective, one informed by his own experiences of Japanese colonialism and North Korean communism. According to Moon, Eve's original sin of betrayal manifests in the real world in Japan's brutality against Korea, and communism was the work of Satan himself, an impediment to Moon's holy mission of global harmony.
I mean,
hardly a church separated from the state. Moon's theology was fundamentally political.
No, Mary Magdalene wasn't.
It would have global political consequences. As Moon yearned for the crucial support of the United States in his anti-communist crusade, he spied his opportunity in 1974. Richard Nixon. As Watergate was bearing down, Moon called on his followers to stand by the so-called Archangel Nixon. The president...
The Archangel Richard Nixon has come to save us! Richard Nixon was an archangel! If only we'd seen it! He could have saved us. No. There were two Marys. There was Mary, Jesus' mother, and then Mary Magdalene was a different Mary. Nixon died for our sins.
Supposedly chosen by God. For 40 days and nights, thousands of so-called Moonies heeded the call with public fasting in support of Nixon. In return, he thanked the fasters and received Moon in the Oval Office,
Resurrected Jesus shaking hands with the Archangel Nixon.
catapulting him and his movement into the zeitgeist. This was the beginning of a long friendship between the GOP and the Unification Church, lasting even to today. In fact,
is that Ford? Ford? Was Ford not an archangel? Was he just like a seraphim or something?
Year in late August, mere weeks after Abe's assassination, Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo spoke at a Unification Church event, praising the church for its commitment to religious freedom and
Dr. Hak Ja Han Moon, tremendous person for her incredible work. He just
anti-communism.
Incredible work on behalf of peace all over the world.
And in Japan, the church's political ties go deeper. In the late 60s, right-wing Japanese politicians sought an alliance with the church through the International Federation for Victory Over Communism, an organization co-founded by Moon and former Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, Shinzo Abe's grandfather.
Oh,
Abe's
shit.
father, Foreign Minister
Shinzo Abe's grandfather was a founder. Dude, we're getting deep into the lore now, baby.
Shintaro Abe continued the family's ties, and over the years, the collaborative relationship between Japan's dominant political party, the LDP, and Moon deepened, as the LDP utilized Unification Church members as campaign workers and volunteers. Even today, recent surveys suggest that half of LDP lawmakers have
Asahi?
substantial
I know
ties
that
to
beer.
the church. But why couldn't the church resist nosing its way so thoroughly into politics? Well, the reason was simple. The church needed protection. Over the years, it's found itself the target of abundant social and legal scrutiny. In the U.S., Congress and the FBI investigated the church, and a New York state court actually revoked its status as a religious organization for a time. In Japan, it lost a number of high-profile cases in the Supreme Court, mandating financial restitution from the church to donors and members. While this scrutiny? Well, it turns out the church's
Nixon
fundraising
feels
tactics aren't
Nixon
exactly
is the
kosher, so to
Archangel
speak.
Michael
They
made
regularly
flesh.
pressure Marx with guilt over Japanese crimes against Korea, promises of relief in the afterlife for recently deceased relatives, and expensive objects with supposedly spiritual power.
Hell yeah, dude.
Their
When I think of
methods are
Japan
deeply manipulative
Korea, I
and
think of
blur the
elephants.
lines between politics, business, and religion, but they are effective, having raised billions of dollars from Japan alone.
I don't know.
Meanwhile, the
You're
church's
deeper in the
favorable
church than I am,
relationship with
bud.
politicians paid off. Whether it was Kishi or the Abes, Nixon or Trump, it was always helpful for
There
politicians
he
to
is,
back
right
up the
there.
church.
There are his wings. That's Nixon's wings as the Archangel.
Church's legitimacy.
They're sending their best.
After all, if nationally elected leaders said the church was doing good work, it couldn't be that nefarious, right? But one family's story is illustrative of just how devastating the church's financial activities could be. A middle-aged Japanese mother, the typical mark for the church's spiritual financial schemes, was manipulated over the course of years into donating the equivalent of $750,000 to the church.
God
Her family's business collapsed. Her oldest son, stricken with cancer, committed suicide because he couldn't afford it.
Really? Bro, did you have to use the cancer ribbon? to attribute this motherfucker with cancer?
because he couldn't afford treatment. Her youngest
What do you mean he couldn't afford treatment? Bitch, you had the money. $3-something million. That's her fault. That's not the church's fault. They're just a really good salesman. Like the Archangel Nixon.
son abandoned his college education because his family no longer had enough money to support him. He, too, attempted suicide in 2005 so that his family might be able to make use of his life insurance. Though he survived, that youngest son couldn't let go of the trauma the church had wrought.
That's wild. That... Dude, it is stand-up. What? Weren't you here when I was watching the goddamn presidential debate? That was peak stand-up, all right? But... the Divine Comedy. Dante's Inferno, round 2. But Japanese life insurance lets you collect if the person commits suicide. That's kind of cool. I mean, it could be manipulated so fucking easily, but...
When he saw earlier this year that Shinzo
transcending ideology, religion, ethnicity, nation, and race.
Abe had addressed a Unification Church gathering, he resolved to finally take action. Bound by Japan's strict gun regulations, he formulated his own gunpowder from fertilizer and built a shotgun at home from woodblock.
Oh, he made
metal
fertilizer, you know, ammonium nitrate, all that stuff. Okay.
With 2 shots from this homemade shotgun.
This is not legal advice. It's not that hard to look up how to make stuff from fertilizer. This is not legal advice. I am in no way endorsing your Google searches and whatever list you get on. It's the information's pretty out there.
Tetsuya Yamagami rang an alarm in Japan's collective consciousness. All of a sudden, calls erupted for investigations into the church and its relationships with various politicians. And so, in a way...
No. Listen, Stratorius, I would not trust any downloads or anything of the Anarchist Cookbook unless you can get it from a verified source that is basically scans of the original, because a lot of the recipes and manufacturing and stuff in the quote-unquote Anarchist cookbooks that are circulating out on the internet have been altered, and you can very seriously hurt yourself because they have been altered for malicious intent or by conspiracy theorists, state actors to keep people from utilizing the things in said cookbook. Just saying that. And yes, Onion, now is the time for this. Me telling you that this is not any kind of advice on how to look up this shit or anything, because of the events that happened today, dog. Now is... this is... if I'm gonna say it, this is the time, all right? Yeah. That is, yeah, it's really good to know. If you have ever thought about buying or downloading a version of the Anarchist Cookbook, you need to ensure that the information is verified from the original, because, like I said, a lot of the recipes and manufacturing and things like that have been manipulated in one way or another in a lot of the modern versions that you can find that you can seriously hurt yourself because they have been made to fail or made to fail in a spectacular way. So,
Asin 1. Public opinion has soured on the church and on Abe. With this turn in public opinion, it seems the answer is clear. The Unification Church ought to lose its status as a religious organization. Except, imagine, just for a moment, the consequences of applying this standard more broadly, and it's easy to see the value in one of liberal democracy's core tenets, that democratic decision-making can't be used to deprive a minority of their basic rights. But the Unification Church is hardly a church at all. For decades, it's abused its religious status, wading into politics and leveraging its spiritual cachet to swindle the vulnerable out of hundreds of billions of yen. Yet, with a little rhetoric and a helping of political violence, what religion couldn't be convincingly described in similar terms?
yeah.
Religion and politics are essentially inseparable because each appeals to the same moral impulses in all of us. The preacher and the politician, from the pulpit and the podium, both claim the same moral authority and righteousness. But that doesn't mean all churches are the same, nor does it mean we shouldn't try to keep them separate. Not least because that separation is a vital assurance that everyone has the freedom to worship as their heart and soul command. But it does mean a good standard is hard to come by, and different countries have reached very different solutions. The French hold to the philosophy of laïcité, total separation. Religion is almost never mentioned in political discussions or campaigns, and it's illegal even to wear symbols of religion, whether headdresses or crucifix necklaces, in government buildings. According to some, ineffective, but to most, a rather uncomfortable standard. Meanwhile, in America, a softer barrier is erected. While it's technically illegal for religious organizations to endorse political candidates, individual preachers regularly make it clear to their congregation whom they support. Today, conservative think tanks acquire the status of religious organizations as fundamentalist religious.
Individual preachers in more Protestant religions, where the preacher of said church is much more like a preacher and a regular person of the community. I can see that. I've never really been to a Protestant mass. I'm formerly Catholic myself, raised Catholic, went Catholic K through 8 school. I have never seen a priest openly endorse any kind of politics. They mainly keep it about, the church and their religion and their job.
Sentiment permeates politics, much of it hostile to democracy and the continued freedom of others to practice their own faiths. While it's easy to point to a specific case like the Unification Church and see that something is clearly wrong, it's much more difficult to draw up a set of rules that can both prevent the emergence of scam religions and maintain freedom of worship. But at the same time, it's one of those difficulties that's imperative, even urgent, to grapple with, because the consequences of neglect, as Abe's death reveals, are truly dangerous.
Tell you what.
Thank you so much for watching.
Abe, Trump today, presidential security has gotten lax.